Back in 2019, I made a video about the AMD R9 Nano. Then a 4-year-old GPU that had a lot of things going for it that made it pretty relevant in the modern era, modern being 2019. It had comparable performance to a mid-range card, fast HBM memory, and was based on the Fiji architecture. Fast forward to 2023, and I bought an AMD Radeon VII, a descendant of that very same card, based off of a descendant of the Fiji architecture, still has HBM memory, and outside of ray tracing, should be pretty comparable to a modern card nowadays, especially with 16 gigabytes of very fast HBM2 memory. For gamers on a budget, should this be a card they're considering? Well, it's really going to come down to the user and the price. I was able to buy this card for $200, which is kind of a steal, considering this card is often selling on eBay for as much as $300 plus. I did have to do a little bit of cleaning and maintenance on the card. The fans were already starting to fail, which, again, it's a 4-year-old card, the fans are going to fail. And the previous owner had put some heat sinks on the backplate, so I had to remove those, which required a fair bit of elbow grease. But now that it's all removed and clean and the fans are now working again, it looks pretty much like a brand new card, and we can get to benchmarking. And starting off with LEGO Builder's Journey, we can see that this card at 1080p max quality settings, we're getting a little bit under 100 FPS. And the only thing I've done with this card in terms of like overclocking is actually an undervolt, which if you have ever heard anything about this card, you really need to do in order to manage temperature. And once that was in place, the card runs much cooler, much quieter, and all the games work just fine. Obviously, this game is a pretty slow-paced game, so 100 FPS is a little bit of overkill, but yeah, all the bells and whistles turned on, except for ray tracing, and you have a very playable experience, even with this pretty graphically intensive game. On the opposite end of the coin is Turbo Overkill, which has a really retro look, and it's a little bit simplistic in the graphics, but at 1080p, everything turned up to max, we're getting north of 200 FPS at all times. And this being a faster Twitch game, you really need that extra FPS in order to really play this game well. But yeah, a modern game, but with simple graphics, has no problem running at very high refresh rates with the Radeon VII. Gears Tactics is a tactical game released in 2020, and based off of the Gears of War engine, it looks very good. At 1080p, everything turned up, and we're getting above 90 FPS pretty much at all times. And just like with LEGO, it is a slower paced game, so you don't really need that many FPS to have an enjoyable experience. I've played this game at 30 FPS on a Steam Deck, and it works just fine. But it's nice to know that you can play it with everything turned up if you wanted to, or you could play it at much higher resolutions and just play with the settings a bit. Switching over into Cyberpunk, and with everything turned up and no FSR, no upscaling, we are going to be in the 45 to 50 FPS range most of the time. Now, it's going to be dependent on scenes, and when it's really empty, you could probably be above 60 FPS. But this is still not too bad, especially considering if you really needed to get to 60 FPS, there are a multitude of settings that you could play with, or you could enable FSR. But still, very demanding game, very playable on the Radeon VII. Hellblade is a few years old at this point, but with everything turned up, it still looks pretty amazing. And at 1080p on the Radeon VII, we're hovering around 90 FPS while in game. You'll get a few dips down into like the 70s when there are a lot of effects on screen, but pretty much with no upscaling enabled, it's a really great experience and means that you could play at higher resolutions if you needed to. Guardians of the Galaxy is another recent game, and with everything turned up at 1080p In some of the easier scenes, you're going to be more in like the 100 to 120 FPS range. But when the world opens up and there's a lot more geometry on screen, you are going to dip down into around 60 FPS with a few dips down into the 50s. Still a very good experience, and you could lower a few settings in order to kind of get a lock 60 FPS at all times. Kenna Bridge of Spirits is a 2021 game, and it pretty much looks like you're playing a 3D animated movie. And at 1080p, everything turned up again, we are right around 60 to 65 FPS pretty much at all times, with a few dips down into just below 60 FPS when the action heats up. Since most of this game is about traversal instead of it being about, epic fight sequences, you probably don't even need to play with the settings at all. But if you did want to play at a higher refresh rate, or if you wanted to go to a higher resolution, you could lower down the settings. But this game also supports FSR. Back in 2019, when the Radeon VII was released, 16 gigabytes of video memory seemed like overkill, with the common belief being that by the time games needed 16 gigabytes of memory, the card wouldn't be worth anything anymore. Well, Hogwarts Legacy came out in 2023, and it is a little bit of a memory hog, and we can see this running through Hogsmeade, that we are using about 12 and a half gigabytes of memory, and holding at about 60 to 65 FPS most of the time. So there we have it, proving all those 2019 reviewers wrong. The card is still viable at a time when you actually need greater than 8 gigabytes of memory. And while most of the game is going to be playable above 60 FPS with these settings, you are going to drop down into the upper 40s when you're like traversing really fast on your broom, going through trees and such. So at that point, you might want to turn on FSR just to get that locked 60 FPS performance. But yeah, solid performance 4 years after it was released. And with the advent of things like FSR and the fact that this has 16 gigabytes of memory, this card could be useful for the next several years. So if you are in the market for a rather large mid-range GPU, the Radeon VII isn't too bad of a deal if you can find it for $200 or under.